You're going to bond to the lower forward section here. And here. And you're going to bond here. Forward section only. And we'll make reference to other jig. The last bonding will occur on the lower face. And what we've done is we've measured forward a 1/4 inch off of the trailing edge. You're going to bond to the bottom section, a 1/4 inch forward of the aft edge of your jig. You're going to bond here. You're going to bond here. You're going to bond here, and you're going to bond here. Attempt to keep epoxy off of these surfaces. If you want, you can put protective silver tape down when you get ready to do your bonding. And I'll get some glue and some small nails, and I'll be back to you in a moment. Not that it's absolutely necessary, but the silver tape here will clearly show where we bond and where we don't bond. This is not necessary for you to do, obviously, but I want it so that you can, in a single glance, know where plywood goes and where it doesn't go. You can see here the part line. So we'll make a cut along that line. You can follow right through the cut line. Double bond here, 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 and there. Back in a moment, right? I've mixed up one shot of flux here. I got the cameraman, what a luxury, to come on, to move his lens onto the epoxy mix that I've got. It's one shot of west, fast. And I'm going to add a small amount of flux to it to increase its thickness, so it's a little better at gap filling. Doesn't have to be real thick. And if you can see this mix, it's like the end of a bad cold. Oops, excuse the joke. A little epoxy on each of these areas. West, wood epoxy saturation technique. It really soaks into the wood. Some of this plywood was retrieved from old jigs that I made a couple of years ago on the first wings that I built for Berkut, and the white glue failed when it got a little damp. Let's see what kind of a transfer we get. Not bad, not bad at all. We'll make a little more resin on this surface here. Get a good bond transfer. A little squish. Make sure it's within the confines of the edges of the jig. Don't need to waste a brush for this. Tongue depressor works just fine. All this is fairly well documented in the plans. Don't depend entirely on just these videotapes for anything. Understand why these things are being done. It is said by, I think, folks in the FAA that the most important part of this process is what you learn from it. And I personally believe that a person who builds their own airplane is never going to be a safer pilot in any other vehicle than one that they understand mechanically. And there's no better way to understand an airplane mechanically than by building it yourself. And last but not least, I imprint it so that I can tell where the epoxy goes to. Put a little more down. Flush with the edge. Now this is West. It's pretty fast stuff. I'm going to stick a nail in the middle of each bond line. Hold it in place while the epoxy sets. Make sure you're inside the edge. Weights work just as well. Just make sure that they don't move after you get them in place. Put your weights on and come back about 5 minutes later and see if they've slid. You ruin your whole day. If I had my pneumatic stapler here, it seems to have grown legs a few days ago, I would just zap that with a couple of staples to hold it in place. I don't think that nail's going to work. Yank and stick it on with good old-fashioned gravity. Okay. We'll get back to you when this is set, and then we'll drill the holes and repeat the process on the opposite side. Back again. We're going to go back to the mold process. We bonded the pieces of 1/4-inch plywood to the jig template. And now what we're going to do is show you we found a stapler. We drove staples into it to hold it. The dark area, we heated this. We were impatient. We needed to get done with this videotape. Epoxy's gone off. It isn't moved any. Now what we're going to do is we're going to draw a center line down the center of each one of these areas. Drawn it on this one already. Now then what we do is we measure in 1 inch. We're going to drill a 1/4-inch hole here. Here's the part line. So we're going to measure up 1 inch. Precision here is not absolutely mandatory. It's just 2 bolts. Far enough apart to stabilize. One inch down, 1 inch up. I drill this 1/4 inch. We remove these, and we'll be back to you in a moment. Running? Filming. What we end up with is 4 separate pieces. We're shooting 2. 4 separate pieces. And we're going to flip these over. And we're going to put the plywood in the opposite sides and match drill to the opposite. Flip side. The epoxy in this area isn't fully cured, so I can easily scrape it off either with a chisel or with one of my favorite tools. I've scraped all the others off. Now we do the final assembly. Same operation as was performed on the opposite side. We're going to do much the same thing we did before, which is take a straight edge, align them up, first thing we'll do is we'll drop the bolts that we're going to use to attach it together with in place to preliminarily hold it in shape. And we'll nail it down on top of the table again, like we did before. Now we take a straight edge and make sure that it's straight again. We're on. If it's accurate, we've done it right. And it's straight in both areas, here and here. We also know that this is where we're going to be doing our bonding. You'd be surprised how many times I've bonded on the wrong side of this line. I make it obvious for myself. This is where the resin goes. Again with the silver tape. Silver tape down, find the cut line, cut it off, We do this on all 4 surfaces, and I'll be back with you in a moment. We've removed all the bolts, and in their place, prior to removing the bolts, we drove in nails just outboard of where the plywood is already, with the bolts in place, so that nothing changed shape. So we see two nails here, inboard of the plywood, 2 nails here, outboard of the plywood here, 2 here, outboard of the plywood, and 2 here, inboard of the plywood reinforcement. On this end, the plywood reinforcement is 1/4 of an inch forward of the trailing edge. It does go flush to the bottom edge. I bond on this side. And you can see quite plainly where bonding occurs and where it doesn't. You needn't mark it necessarily because I can see in the opposite surface where the plywood is. This one goes here. And the last one, ignore the holes. We'll put them on the bonding side. This came off of an old jig. Goes here. We're going to mix up a batch of resin, and we'll be back with you in a moment. The reason that I've shown you this time where the resin goes is just a little review. And notice that there are perimeter marks for where the glue goes, only because I don't want to end up having to paint the whole surface to make sure I've got it where it should go. This is an instructional video. Too much is not a harm here. Don't waste a brush in this operation. The flocks in this mix makes it very easy to spread. I didn't show you on the last application. I didn't know where the stapler was. I was looking for my pneumatic and didn't manage to find it, but the electric stapler here worked fairly well. Didn't go all the way through the plywood. Went through far enough to establish its placement on the jig, and just enough to hold it in place. And because epoxies have very good gaps filling properties, not a big deal. So I'm going to get out the old stapler again. But I don't have an extension cord at the moment, so I'll be back to you in a moment. Ready? Some of you may have caught this, but this one was placed in the wrong spot. It's supposed to be 3/4 of an inch further forward. I'll be back to you in a moment with the repair. Here we are. Now we're 1/4 inch forward, trailing edge. The reason for that is that these templates, when they're on their end, have to be able to tilt to match the angle of the cut line on the wing. And if this were right on the edge, it would ride up onto that and bring it out of plane. So Ooh, right on through. That's what we're hoping to happen. Some of them we get lucky, some of them we don't. Now we go back and we don't tear your heart out if you can't get them to go all the way through. I'd like glue pressure while the glue sets. The only thing left to do in this operation is once this glue sets, pull the screws. I'll take this to my drill press and I'll back drill through the holes that we drilled earlier. Make sure all that the edges of these are flush. Nothing is protruding. Well, we're back again. We've flipped it over, dropped bolts in all of the plywood doublers. Recording. And what we're going to do, we're going to remove these bolts and we're going to put clamps down, remove the bolts, and drill in the appropriate areas. Pull the bolts. You think they fit too well. Now we finish up the same on the opposites. Put nuts and washers on the opposite surfaces. And your jigs are complete. And we'll go on to the next section. And you need to grab some of your 1/2-inch thick plywood scrap. And the piece of scraps need to be at least 8 inches on one leg. And if you can see the geometry of this, they're 8 by 8. And they are cut at the angle between the trailing edge and the butt line of any one of your wing sections. Any one but the inboard section. I don't recall the actual angle of this, but this is the outboard aft edge. Use the trailing edge of the foam and the surface upon which your sand down templates go to give you this reference angle. Put your piece of plywood against the surface, mark from underneath, measure up 8 inches, measure over 8 inches, draw a triangle, go to your hardware store and buy some 063 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch aluminum extrusion. We use self-tapping screws to hold it in place. You can glue it on, you can, but preferably just short screws that screw it in place will do the job. The way these things work is the jig itself stands upright. This is the aft trailing edge section of the jig that we just showed you the building of. This is the trailing edge itself. The extrusion would normally go here, and the jig attaches in this fashion. When it's in place, this surface lines up with this corner. When you reverse this jig, you flip it to the opposite side, reversing the angle of this piece. This jig then sits on the table at the angle that the core sits. Actually, this would be trailing edge down. And there's your angle. The jigging technique that we've chosen on this airplane, by design, requires that the jig not sit perpendicular to the table surface. The jig parallels the cut line on the wing, which sits at about 8.5 degrees or so off a vertical. This jig is the outboard wingtip. There's a piece of plywood attached to the side of the jig. It's 8 inches by 8 inches. We step it off a little bit right here. The angle of this is determined by your wing cut angle, and that reference angle is available on your flashings. I used a bevel gauge to take this angle, get it pretty accurate, and place it along my plywood. This one was done in error, so I'm going to remark this and recut all of my wing jigs. And we're going to take the aluminum extrusion and attach them to these surfaces. I'm using sheet metal screws here. I use 3 per extrusion. These can be screwed directly to the top of your table, or you can use these screw inserts that thread directly into the top of the table. With a 1032 thread, you can get them at most hardware stores. They thread right in on the top side. They can be affixed permanently with epoxy, and this surface would be flush with the top side of the table. We're going to set them up so that we can reverse the wing left and right for sure web layups. We're also going to set our table up so that the right wing and left wing can be duplicated very simply without messing up the top side of our table. What you're going to need, as I mentioned before, are some aluminum extrusions. And they're going to be approximately 8 inches in length, maybe 7.5. The bottom edge will be mitered at half of the angle of your bevel. This is position number 1, and your jig is going to go like so. This needs to be flush with this corner, as can be seen here with that jig. We're going to screw this directly to the extrusion, and we'll be back to you in a moment. Okay, we're going to get that last extrusion in. The side of the table helps me hold this in place just snug enough. Now I'm going to give you a reference here. I'm going to show you. This corner is very important. One of the more critical portions of this is that this surface aligns with this portion of the jig. All of the vertical references, whether you're set up for right wing or left wing, will be one corner or the other corner. This corner for right wing, and when you take this jig off and flip it to the opposite side, it will be the other side, and the opposite corner will be the same reference, but it'll be, of course, the opposite edge. We're going to put the bottom jig in place. And it too, same reference. Actually, if your wood is a little high, you can always make up for it by making sure that the aluminum is in line with this edge. I'll grab the screws. Magnetic tip here would be very nice. This is the difficult one. You get this one right, and all the others will fall right into place. Go to the corner, make sure it's parallel. Spot on. We'll go ahead and we'll tighten this one. And we'll do the other two. Put the screw in the center of the hole, or it'll act like a cam and push it out of place. Again. And that sets you up so that the edge of your wood is touching the table its entire length. That's your right wing. Well, what we're looking at here is jig number 1 on your right, 2, 3, and 4. And all the jigs are in their, all of the diagonal jigs are in their correct position. If you were to check each one, what you'd see is a good fit on each angle. And the last one, good position. Now we'll do a setup on the table. We're going to draw a straight line down the table. Our next step is to lay out the position of each jig on your table. Start out by measuring from one side of the table to 17.5 inches in. Both ends. Draw a straight line and then measure from this end, going to measure forward approximately 6 inches. That will be the only measurement that's approximate. From there, we'll measure 51 3/4 inches to the next jig, followed by 103.5 to the next jig, followed by 1/36 and 13/16 to the next jig. We have used a thread-in insert into our table so that we can reproduce this wing after wing after wing. We have several airplanes being built here, and of course this makes it very simple for us. We simply put the jig in position, drop it over top of the thread insert, and insert the screw. This keeps us from devastating the table with all kinds of holes. All the jigs set in position will help you assemble your wing in the jigs. This half the jig will be off when you go to put your foam cores in place. The dimension that I gave you, the very first measurement, will place the forward face of the jig on that line. You can use any reference point on your jig, providing it is a consistent reference point from jig to jig. Second in place. We'll go ahead and put the rest of these things on, and we'll come back to you in a moment and show you what the rest of the assembly looks like. We're going to remove everything that's not pertinent to this particular section. Now, I mentioned we use a threadable insert into our jigs. This is something obviously you don't need to do. You don't have the need for reproducing this effort more than twice, and that reproduction from left to right isn't going to use the same holes. So it becomes impractical for you to use these thread inserts. Another thing, obviously, that you're not going to need is this air ratchet. This is something we already had, and certainly isn't going to hurt us to use. Once we get all these jigs apart off the table, let go! We're going to bring our wing cores out, bond all the butt ends together, slide it into the jig, and show you how that assembly process goes.